Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Lab Notes. My name is Josie, and I'm part of the public engagement team here at Alzheimer's Research UK, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event this afternoon. We are very excited to be joined by Professor Jon Schott, Professor Selina Wray, and David Thomas, and together we will explore the concept of a cure for dementia and what that might mean. But first, before we get started, I'm going to go over a little bit of housekeeping before our event today. So I'll just share my slides with you now. So during the event today, you are welcome to switch on the automatic subtitles using the CC button at the bottom of your screen. They're not 100% accurate during the live event, and Zoom is getting better and better at live subtitles. However, sometimes it cannot identify some of the scientific terms that our speakers might be using. The subtitles will be edited so they are correct on the event recording, and we can also share a transcript with you of the event as well. During the event today, if you would like to ask a question, you need to click the Q&A button, which should appear at the bottom of your screen. This will bring up the Q&A box where you can type your question. Today, we'll be having a discussion during the whole event, so please do keep submitting your questions as we go along, and I'll ask them to our speakers. If you are having any technical difficulties, you can also use the Q&A button to let our team know. So now we're going to ask you a few poll questions, because while we can't see you due to the online format of the event today, we're really keen to know a little bit more about you. So those should be appearing on your screen now. So the first question is, how would you rate your current knowledge of dementia research? So it's very high, high, average, low, or very low. The second question is, which of these best describes your reasons for attending this event today? So do you have dementia? Does a friend or a family member have dementia? Are you a carer? Is your work related to dementia? Or perhaps you don't have a personal question, but you just want to find connection, but you just want to find out more about dementia. And our final question, is this your first dementia research event? So I'll just give it a couple of seconds while those answers come in. I can see lots of you answering those questions now. And then in a moment, we'll share those with you. So those should have appeared on your screen. So most people with an average knowledge of dementia research, that's great. Hopefully you will learn something in our event today. Of reasons why people are here. Lots of people with a friend or a family member with dementia, lots of people whose work is related to dementia, and lots of people have been to an event before, which is brilliant. And welcome to those of you who are new and have not come to one of our lab notes before. We hope you enjoy it. So hopefully you should see those now on your screen. So moving on to the topic of today's event. So we have recently revealed that if nothing changes, 1 in 2 of us will be directly impacted by dementia. So we will either care for someone who has it, develop it ourselves, or both. And we know that this cannot go on. There is a new optimism in the field of dementia research. You may have heard on the news about a new generation of treatments emerging, and for the first time, we have the prospect of drugs that will act on the disease processes that cause dementia, rather than helping with the symptoms alone. Today, we'll be hearing from our panel of experts on what a cure means to them and their work, and the important steps that we need to take to get there. It's my pleasure today to be joined by Professor Jon Schott, who is Chief Medical Officer of Alzheimer's Research UK and also Professor of Neurology at the Dementia Research Centre at UCL. We'll also be joined by Professor Selina Wray, who is Professor of Molecular Neuroscience in the Department of Neurodegenerative Diseases, also at UCL, and also David Thomas, who is Head of Policy here at Alzheimer's Research UK, with a focus on research funding and innovation, as well as enabling access to new treatments. As I said before, you can submit your questions at any point during the event, and we will try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have. Just to say that we can't provide clinical advice in response to your questions about individual situations, so please do get in touch with our Dementia Research info line or your GP if you have specific or personal questions. We'll be sharing the phone number and email address for our info line at the end of our event. So without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite our wonderful panel of speakers to join me live. Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining us here today. So Jon, I think we're going to come to you first. So please could you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and your role, and then perhaps what a cure means to you and what does it mean for you in your work?
Thank you very much, Josie. It's a great pleasure to be here and to join Selina and David too. So as you sort of alluded to in the introduction, I wear a number of different hats. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Alzheimer's Research UK. I'm a dementia researcher, but I'm also an NHS consultant, and I run a clinic when I see patients with cognitive concerns and dementia. And when patients come to see me, everyone course has got concerns about their memory and thinking, and my job is to try initially is to reach a diagnosis. In many cases, we're able to reassure people that there isn't a brain illness that's causing their cognitive problems, but of course, for many people, we'll be diagnosing them with a form of dementia, often Alzheimer's disease, but other forms of dementia as well. And there's huge advantages having a diagnosis if you've got concerns about your problems, to be able to put a name to it, to be able to receive appropriate care and counselling. And we do have some treatments that can help symptoms. But we're far away from where we would want to be in terms of the treatments that we have to offer. And that's where this idea of a cure comes from. Now, actually defining a cure is quite complicated, and the more I think about it, the more complicated I think it gets. I think it means different things to different people and probably different things in different contexts and different diseases. So for instance, if you've got a chest infection, then you're going to want to receive an antibiotic. That antibiotic, we're going to want to get rid of the chest infection, make you feel better, and return you to your everyday life without any problems with your breathing and without necessarily having mortality associated with it. But of course, we know that even in the best case scenario with people with chest infections, we can't always cure them, and chest infections are actually the commonest reasons that people actually pass away. So even when we have cures for some disease, they won't apply to everyone. And when we think about more complex illnesses like dementia or cancer, the situation becomes more complicated. And if we use cancer as an analogy, because there are sort of many commonalities with dementia, cancer has got lots of different causes. There are lots of different types of cancer. But we've made huge strides forward, and people often say that cancer treatments are maybe 20, 25 years ahead of where we are with dementia. So everyone here will know somebody who's been diagnosed with a cancer and has received a treatment, chemotherapy or radiotherapy or various, often combinations of treatments. And that's sometimes put people into remission, so they don't have the symptoms, and to all intents and purposes, the cancer has gone away, although can, of course, recur. We know people who will have been, their cancer will have been picked up when they've got no symptoms through screening, through cervical screening or mammography or having other colonoscopy. And then we can pick the cancers up early and treat them and prevent the cancer from starting. And then we know, of course, about public health things that we can do, stopping smoking to prevent lung cancer, knowing the biology of these diseases better. Those of you with children or grandchildren who are teenagers will know that they're now being vaccinated against the human papillomavirus, which we think is going to dramatically cut the number of women who develop cervical cancer in their 40s, because there's a strong link between the two. Now, not all cancer is curable or treatable, and for those cancers that aren't treatable, we still need to provide expert care and palliation and look after people very well. But if we take a step back and say dementia is 20, 25 years behind where we are with cancer, we know there's lots of different forms of dementia, of which Alzheimer's disease is the commonest cause. And until recently, we really have been very limited in the sorts of treatments that we've got to these treatments that are licensed for mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease dementia, and that can impact slightly on symptoms. But we really are on the cusp of developing new treatments that can really radically impact not just on the symptoms, but the cause of Alzheimer's disease. There's been a lot of excitement about some new immunotherapy drugs. These are drugs given by infusions that can clear one of the culprit proteins responsible for Alzheimer's disease, the amyloid protein, from the brain. And in clinical trials, seem to slow the progression of disease by 20 to 25%. These aren't yet available in the United Kingdom, although we in the research community and Alzheimer's Research UK are pushing very hard for those advances to be made available. And these aren't the only cure. These are perhaps the first chink in the armory, and they're not going to be for everybody. In fact, they'll probably be for very few people, and they're expensive and difficult to give. But they are an absolute exemplar that through research, through understanding the biology, through designing the sorts of research that Selina does, looking at the cells, letting us understand the processes, can lead to the sort of advances that clinical researchers like me can take into patients working with the pharmaceutical companies. And so we really are on the cusp of new treatments, but it is the cusp. This is the start, I think, of when we can begin to even think about cures for dementia. In the knowledge that there's not going to be one treatment. This is many forms of dementia apart from Alzheimer's disease. This won't be for everybody, but hopefully is that staging post that says that these diseases, some of these diseases that cause dementia, are tractable. There is something that we can do about this, and hopefully this will lead to the revolution in dementia treatments that we saw when we had the first chemotherapeutic agents, or the first drugs for HIV, or the first clot-busting drugs for stroke, or the first drugs for multiple sclerosis, which have made dramatic changes in the last 20 years for all of them in terms of people living with these sorts of illnesses.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jon. I think you've touched on so much there that we might get into later on in our event today. So that was a really wonderful summary of all the challenges and problems that the concept of a cure is sort of poses. But I'm really excited to hear more about what you think about them in a bit more detail later on. Selina, perhaps we'll come to you next with the same question. So if you could just introduce yourself and what you do, and then tell us about what a cure would mean for you in your role.
Absolutely. So hi everyone, and thank you, Josie, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you all today to discuss a little bit around this theme. So I am a molecular neuroscientist based at UCL. Molecular neuroscience is a really fancy way of saying I work on really small stuff. So although I work with very closely with Jon, I'm really at the opposite end of the research spectrum. So my lab does preclinical research. This means that we are interested in understanding dementia at the molecular level. And specifically the question that we are interested in is what causes the death of brain cells in the brains of people with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. And the reason that this is an important question is if we get a really deep understanding of those early stages of molecular dysfunction, that tells us where we need to intervene when we think about treatments. So what should we be targeting if we want to develop treatments that will really intervene in the different forms of dementia at a very early stage? So what does a cure mean for me? Well, I think like Jon, I spent a bit of time thinking about the definition of a cure, even looked it up on Google actually, because I was like, how can I put this into words? And I think for me, you know, I was originally thinking about a cure in the sense of somebody having a disease and we can give them a treatment that means they no longer have that disease. Now, that's not where we are at the minute with Alzheimer's, but we are moving into a new era where we can change outcomes. So we can give we will be able to give treatments that either delay the onset or slow the progression of the disease. And so, as Jon said, we're really on the cusp of a new era in being able to do that. What does that mean for my research? Well, I think if I can start with a moment of reflection, I think it gives us some reassurance that we are doing the right things. So we are taking discoveries and following them up in the right way, and that kind of incremental step-by-step knowledge is moving us from the lab to the clinic. I think it's also really good to reflect on how long this process has taken. So the new treatments that Jon referred to are based on discoveries that were initially made about 30 years ago. So this is a long process of translation. And that, for me, tells us that going forward, we really need to maintain the pipeline. And what I mean by that is we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. We've heard already, and I'm sure we'll get into in more detail, that these treatments are far from perfect. And so we need to make sure that we have a constant flow of projects that are at different stages of translation, because not all of them will make it to the clinic. Some of them will fail, and we need to ensure that we're not going back to step one each time. And for that to happen, we need this continuous investment to enable that pipeline to be maintained, but also to accelerate this timeline. I talked about this kind of 30-year journey from an initial genetic discovery to the new treatments that we're talking about. What can we do as an organization, as a dementia research community, that we can actually shorten that time frame? And we're starting to see that happen. I'm sure David might mention some of that in the dementia task force and things that are happening, so that we can speed up that progression. So, for me, it's a really exciting time to be in dementia research. I think it's given us a lot of motivation as a field, but I'm also not about to hang up my lab coat, right? We have a lot more work to do, and we need as many treatments targeting as many different molecular mechanisms that we can possibly develop.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Selina. David, finally, the same question to you. So tell us a little bit about who you are and what does a cure mean for you in your role?
Hello, everyone. It's fantastic to be speaking to everyone today. And I think, really important question. And John and Selina have, I think, put very articulately some of the, the opportunities that are in the dementia space right at the moment. And I think so my role at Alzheimer's Research UK, I'm in the policy and public affairs team. And basically what we do for the organisation is to work with government to ensure that our government and also our health service are both supporting the research that we need to do to develop new treatments, new diagnostics, and help prevent dementia, and also that they are getting ready for these medicines. And I think we'll come on to talk a bit more around what needs to happen from a health service perspective, that when we do have treatments that are effective and safe, that we're actually able to ensure they make their way to the people who benefit from them. So that's the role that we play within Alzheimer's Research UK as a charity that obviously focuses on medical research in the dementia space. On this question, I think that we all know the harm and the heartbreak that is caused by dementia and the impact that has. I had both my grandmothers had dementia and sadly died from dementia, and I know that so many people on this call also have that contact, either living with themselves or know loved ones who have had the diseases that could cause dementia. So for me, for a cure is a really visionary statement about the hope that we could have of ultimately that we live in a world where there isn't that very negative impact that dementia has in lots of different ways. And I think to add to, I guess, what John and Selina outlined in terms of how you would look at the definition of this, I think it really needs to start with what matters to people living with dementia, what matters to individuals. When we talk about the outcomes that we could improve, I think that's something which we all need to reflect on, and it'll be different for different people as well, in terms of things like maintaining independence, people being able to maintain the relationships with their family and their friends, all of these different elements that I think sometimes people with dementia will, that is stripped away from them. That for me, for a cure is around how we address that, and how we incrementally, as we develop new treatments, we get to that point where we won't see that same really negative impact that it has for so many people. So I think that's something which I find really motivating, and I think, as we've said, we're at a very exciting time when we do feel on the threshold where we can start to chip away at dementia.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David. It's just really interesting to hear the three of you as sort of a clinician and a researcher, and then obviously somebody working at Alzheimer's Research UK, and how this same concept sort of brings us all together with this really clear sort of vision, as you said, David. Perfect. So we've had a few questions in the chat, I can see, so keep those coming through. It's really great to see you asking lots of questions. The next thing I would like to talk about a bit is, what would a cure look like in real life. So how is this actually going to get to the people with dementia and the people who need it? So we've had a few pre-submitted questions, so I might start with one of these first. So somebody asked, my mum has recently been diagnosed with mild to moderate Alzheimer's. How far are we away from new drugs being widely available on the NHS to help her and others? And is there hope, or are we looking long term for a cure? And somebody else had also asked, assuming it won't be possible to treat everyone immediately, are there any discussions of who should get any cure first? So those furthest along, those just starting, or somewhere in the middle. So Jon, perhaps I'll come to you first to maybe tell us a little bit about some of these new treatments that are coming through, and sort of who they are suitable for, and what the sort of next steps in the progress is for that, and what would they look like in real life, these current treatments.
Of course. So the first thing I think is to state is just to reiterate, which will be obvious to many but not to all, that there are many different forms of dementia, and that we're going to concentrate a little bit on Alzheimer's disease in my answer today, because Alzheimer's disease is the disease that we know most about, is the commonest form, and therefore is the area that most therapeutics are currently directed towards. But there are also major programs of research into new drugs for other diseases, for dementia with Lewy bodies, for frontotemporal dementia as well. So that's the first thing is to say. I think the second thing is to reflect on what Selina talked about this pipeline and this timeline. So that the drugs that perhaps I'm going to concentrate on talking about are the ones that are now tipping over and are actually beginning to get licensed in the United States and being put to the licensing authorities in this country. But behind them, there's a pipeline of other drugs with different approaches. And the history of drug development in complex diseases, I've mentioned HIV and cancer and stroke, is often one of the most difficult things is to get the first of a new set of drugs across the line. And thereafter, we get a flurry of other drugs as well. So the drugs that we're particularly focusing on at the moment, because they are closest to implementation, are drugs that are given by intravenous infusion. So that's a cannula in the arm and then an infusion. And they are targeting Alzheimer's disease, and they're targeting one particular process in Alzheimer's disease, which is the accumulation of this protein amyloid within the brain. There are lots of other proteins in the brain, as well as amyloid and tau and neuroinflammation and lots of other things that you might have read about. But these drugs, and the drugs that are closest to implementation, are drugs called lecanemab and donanemab. And the mab at the end means that these are monoclonal antibody and antibody therapies, and other antibody therapies are used in rheumatoid arthritis and cancers and so forth. And these are expensive drugs, is the first thing to say. And at the moment, they need to be given intravenously, although in due course, it may be possible to give them through an injection under the skin, like you do get delivered insulin, and who knows, one day perhaps orally by mouth, which would be game-changing. So these are expensive drugs. They require regular infusions. One of those drugs is once a month, once every 2 weeks. And they require very strict entry criteria. And when we start giving drugs, we tend to give the drugs to the same sort of people who will have been in the major trials when they were shown to be successful. So these are all based on large studies of a few thousand people, and they're often quite carefully selected. So often when drugs are licensed, we give them to those sorts of people who are quite carefully selected not to have other sorts of illnesses. Just to say that delivery of these drugs not only requires them to be given regularly, but also to have quite a lot of safety monitoring. There's a general rule in medicine that the more powerful the drug, the potential, the more powerful the side effects. I'm sure most people on the line will know people who have run into problems with chemotherapy agents for cancer. If you want to really impact on cancer, there are risks of infections and other problems, and sometimes even death from giving powerful treatments. And so this requires a lot of safety monitoring by the way of scans, and it requires special scans or lumbar punctures to begin to, before you can even get the drugs. So the state of play we are at the moment is that we've had some very encouraging trial data, and some of these drugs are now getting a license for use in the United States. And in the United States, then there are ongoing discussions about whether they will be covered financially by Medicare and Medicaid. Similar discussions are beginning to start, but are slightly behind those discussions in America, in both Europe and in the UK, in that the regulatory authorities are now looking at the data, that's the MHRA in this country, of these trials, to see whether they view them to be effective and safe. And we hope, and David will probably have the timelines better than me, that we'll get an answer from them before too long. If a drug is licensed, it means that a doctor can prescribe it in this country. The next hurdle will be to go through the processes, which is an organization that most people have heard of called NICE, which is the organization from the National Health Service, which evaluates not just whether a drug works, but whether it's cost effective so that it can be given to all that need it. And that's a bigger hurdle still. And again, this is something that Alzheimer's Research UK and we in the research community more generally and the clinical community are pushing very hard for, to make sure that this is given a fair hearing. We want to give drugs that work to our patients, but we only want to do so if they do work and they can be given safely. Then we need to start gearing up the National Health Service for the delivery of these drugs. And we've seen this for stroke and cancer before, that at the moment we just don't have the infrastructure to see people and scan them and give them infusions. And we need to gear up. And again, there's a big amount of policy work going on amongst others, Alzheimer's Research UK, to push the government and the NHS to get these things up to speed, like we established centres for stroke that could give clot-busting therapies and saw the benefits outweighed hugely the effects of the drugs just by organising the services. So you can see that this is a very prolonged and complicated programme. And if I'm honest, is that if somebody were diagnosed with mild Alzheimer's disease today, I think it's highly unlikely that in the best case scenario, we'd be in a position to be giving these drugs to anybody within a year. And if so, they'd be given to very small numbers of people, selected places, probably in specialist centres to start with. And that's also important to make sure that things are safe when they're given in a real life context, as opposed to very, very selected clinical trials. So realise that this is frustrating to a lot of people. And what I think we in the clinical community want to do is to encourage people that this is a step forward, to keep people infused and understanding about the huge benefits, but also to temper people's enthusiasm and not to raise hopes that we can't deliver on, that we will have drugs that we can give widely to everyone who might need them in a short period of time. So sorry, that's a bit of a lengthy answer, but it's quite a complicated question.
It is a very complicated question. Thank you so much, John, for summarising that for us and sort of outlining some of those key challenges that we'll be facing. David, would you like to talk to us a little bit more about some of those policy challenges that John alluded to, and sort of your work into speaking to the government and sort of bringing dementia and dementia research higher up on the government's agenda? Would you be able to tell us a bit more about that?
Of course, absolutely, and yeah, John, it was a very good summary of what some of those kind of key barriers and the next steps for those drugs. Just in terms of some of the timescales, I know John did mention this, but as an aside, so we expect the regulators to look at lecanemab, which is the first drug that John was talking about, probably by the end of this year, and then it moves into the process where the NHS looks at whether they could afford to fund that drug, the NICE process in England and SMC process in Scotland, as John mentioned. So we wouldn't expect people to receive lecanemab, which is the furthest ahead in terms of the regulatory journey, until probably the end of next year at the very earliest. As John says, it's a question then of how widely that could be rolled out across the health system. So we are doing a number of things, both as Alzheimer's Research UK and more widely, as a kind of research and charity community to kind of push on this. And I think the first one, if we need to continue the investment in clinical trials, just because we have these new initially promising drugs, the more I look at this issue, the more I kind of understand that the development of new treatments is such an incremental thing that a genuine sort of miracle drug, as the media often sort of calls them, is a rarity if it ever has really happened. So it's building on the understanding we get from every clinical trial, that both the ones that are positive and that are negative, they all give us scientific answers, and how we apply that. So ensuring that government plays its part in really exploring how we can continue to invest in research, but get better research, faster research, ensuring that we are that we've got good participation from a range of people from all different communities in dementia research and clinical trials. That's really important. That's one of the reasons why Alzheimer's Research UK, our Chief Executive Hilary Evans, is currently co-chairing the government's dementia mission, and that's an initiative which the government is supporting and putting money behind to look at what can we practically do to kind of really accelerate the work that's already happening, and to kind of pull together the different initiatives which are in this space to make things go faster, and to ensure we've got that range of treatments that John and Selina were talking about. I think the other two things which are really really important that we're pushing on from a policy perspective that John also mentioned is firstly, in terms of how the NHS makes decisions about what it can and can't afford. We know that a new Alzheimer's drug will be expensive. We know potentially that you could be looking at a bigger population than perhaps other disease areas. We also know that a lot of the costs of when you do a cost benefit analysis, a lot of the costs of dementia currently they don't fall on the NHS because there are lack of treatments. And I think we all know there are challenges with how much has been invested in actually diagnosing people with dementia in the health service, and given all the other pressures that the NHS is facing. So a lot of the costs to the economy and to people fall outside of the NHS. It falls on the unpaid carers who are having to leave work to look after a loved one. So something which we've been saying to the NHS is they really need to ensure that their methods, how they go about assessing whether they look at these new drugs as whether they are cost effective, kind of really look at the whole benefits that these drugs will offer. So, for example, we know that as a carer, there is an impact on your quality of life and your health, if for many people. So if a drug benefits the person who you're caring from, then it is also having a benefit from you. So how do we factor that into the way the NHS looks at all the costs and all the benefits that a new drug could do, and so that's something which we're pressing on with organisations like NICE. I think the other issue which John also highlighted that is spot on and is a really big challenge is around the setup we have in the NHS. The sort of accurate and early diagnosis that you would need to get to enable to match people to these new drugs just isn't happening routinely. It's happening in some places, but we really think that for the NHS to be ready, it needs to be ready for everyone who could benefit from this. So it shouldn't be an accident of your geography. If you live in an area where you do have access to clinicians who could use this drug, who can diagnose accurately enough, have the right diagnostic tools to do that, that needs to happen everywhere in the UK, regardless of where you live. So that really does involve more investment in the way that we diagnose, and really changing how the NHS organises itself. Obviously that is a big ask at a time where the NHS is facing lots of other pressures, but with these new treatments coming, we don't think that there is time to waste on this. So having a plan, and not just for these other couple of the drugs which are coming through at the moment, it's also more widely. We hope that this will mean a kind of steady pipeline, and that we're looking at a range of treatment options for everyone with dementia. So the health service needs to get ready for that. So that's something which, from a policy and advocacy perspective, we're really pushing the government on, working with the government and the NHS, also working with MPs in Parliament. That's a big part of the role of my team, to kind of be making that case. And I think that we always look to our supporters as well, like people who are watching right now, that to make their voices heard about how important this is, and how it needs to be a priority, because of the impact that it has. I could say lots more, but hopefully that was helpful.
And I might just come in very briefly, because a point I wanted to make, which actually has been picked up by a question from Peter in the audience, is that we have a fabulous exemplar of how, if there's enough political, public will and investment in research, you can make major changes very quickly, which is around COVID. And very much we're trying to learn the lessons of that, to do things in parallel rather than step by step, to really put the investment together, to cut through the red tape to get these drugs to people as soon as possible. And that's a big part of the dementia mission that our CEO is co-leading, is to learn those lessons and to work carefully and closely with the people who did roll out the COVID vaccination so quickly and effectively, and to do the sorts of partnerships between pharma and the universities that we saw with the AstraZeneca-Oxford combination, and how well that worked to harness the power of academics with pharma and the NHS to be able to roll out the new vaccines and hopefully new dementia treatments at scale and quickly.
Thank you, John. Yeah, thanks for picking up that question from Peter as well. We've got a question from Jeff about which sort of leads from this. So what is the relationship between ARUK and big pharma like Biogen, so big pharmaceutical companies? How does our work sort of feed into each other? How are we collaborating with pharmaceutical companies? Selina, would you be able to touch on a little bit of that, about sort of from a researcher perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we've collaborated really productively with a number of pharmaceutical companies over the years, and I think having those links is really important. Now, obviously, when we have research in the lab that is funded by Alzheimer's Research UK, we're doing that independently, and pharma are not influencing the questions we're asking or the tools we're developing or the results that we get. However, if we do get a result that's potentially promising in terms of its translational potential, i.e., could this be a drug target, I won't always have the people power or the equipment or a lab that can operate at the necessary scale to be able to move that forward effectively. And for my personal research, this is kind of the arena where our collaboration with pharmaceutical companies has been really helpful, that we can discuss with a company and say, look, we've got the target, we think this is what needs to happen, but actually I don't have the capabilities to do it. And we then work together productively so they can set up the large scale screens, the big toxicity studies, and so on and so forth, and sort of fill in the gaps that need to happen between what we do in the lab and also a clinical trial. Before I finish on that point, I would also add that I think within the UK dementia landscape, we also have the Alzheimer's Research UK Drug Discovery Institutes, which exist within universities, but operate more on the model of a small biotech, in that they are there to maybe, if, I could go to Big Pharma and they say, well, actually, we're not interested in that target yet, but the DDIs can actually do some of that work, some of that screening that would help to bridge that gap. And so take something that's been developed into an academic lab, make it more, I don't know if palatable is the right word, maybe move it to a stage where it's more ready for a pharmaceutical company to pick up. It's also really important, I'm sure John will touch on this, when we move into thinking about trials, because in the academic arena, we do not have funding of the necessary amount to really be able to run clinical trials ourselves.
We actually did, for anybody interested to hear more about the DDIs, we did our previous lab notes was called Emerging Treatments, and we had Fiona and Paul, who are the chief scientific officers of the UCL and Oxford DDIs, and we had a whole hour discussion with them all about their work and what they're doing. So if you do want to hear more about that, then have a look on our lab notes webpage, and you'll be able to find the link to watch the recording of that video. But yeah, so it's I think it's always just really important to know that we won't be able to do this alone. Our For a Cure vision is not just us at Alzheimer's Research UK. We need that collaboration between pharmaceutical companies, between the NHS, between government, and also other charities working in the space as well. So yeah, there's no way we can do this alone. We've had a question pre-submitted, and it also ties into one that Peter has asked live. Bear with me a second. So it's a little bit about, if a cure can be found, do you think that parts of the brain that have been lost will be able to be restored, or are these bits lost forever? And Peter has said I'll just read this out. Are the dead brain cells permanently defunct, or are they just in suspended animation capable of being resurrected? I think those two questions are kind of linked together. So would anybody like to start on that question, Jon or Selina? Selina.
I can start, and then Jon, maybe you can compliment or disagree with me depending on what I say. I think this is a really important question. It's something, the reason that I sort of put my hand up to start is because my own lab works on stem cell research. It's something that I'm asked a lot. If you can make these stem cell derived brain cells in the lab, can you just replace the cells that are lost in the brain? And I think that's incredibly difficult, because of the complexity of the brain and the fact that, you know, we can't currently replace cells in a way that they would all connect and form the complex circuitry that our brains have now. So for me, you know, where I feel most optimistic about research is actually preventing that cell death from happening in the first place. I think once the cells are already not necessarily dysfunctional, I think dysfunction we might be able to rescue, but once they're already dead, I think it's incredibly difficult for us to think about how we can get them back. However, I would say that in some other diseases, and you know, what we learn from other diseases can really inform what we know about Alzheimer's disease and dementia as well. And there are certainly trials ongoing, for example, in Parkinson's disease, that are looking at cell replacement strategies. Now, that is a lot, I'm going to say easier in quotation marks, because of course nothing is easy, but in Parkinson's disease, we know the cell loss starts in a very small, well-defined region. And so cell replacement therapy is something that maybe seems more achievable than in Alzheimer's disease, when the cell loss is throughout the whole brain. So although at the minute I feel that preventing cell death is probably the most achievable way we will move forward, I would never rule anything out completely. Jon, is that fair?
No, I agree with that absolutely. I mean, there's nothing in medicine when prevention isn't better than cure, the bottom line is that we don't have a viable strategy for replacing brain cells, and brain cells are so specific in their subtypes. We think about cells that can easily regenerate, livers and so forth, when the cells are all very similar, but the huge complexity of the brain, 80 billion nerve cells, each joined to one another in hundreds of different ways, I think makes regeneration very, very complicated. So I would agree entirely, but I would also, again, pick up on one of the points from Peter's questions, and which Selina raised, is that this is a process between having a normal cell and a dead cell, during which there's a range of dysfunction. And I think it may well be possible that some of these treatments that we be able to do might be able to rescue cells that are on their way to dying, if not by the time they've died completely.
Thank you so much, both. I just wanted to touch on a little bit about other diseases that can cause dementia. I know, Jon, you mentioned this already. Obviously, we are called Alzheimer's Research UK, but we fund research into all of the different diseases that cause dementia. So I wonder if either of you could talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the other research into those other areas. Perhaps we had I know tau is sort of still Alzheimer's related. So perhaps we'll go to the other diseases first, and then we'll come back to tau. Jon or Selina, either of you.
Shall I just start off by outlining what the other diseases are, and then I can
yes, please.
to Selina, who has got the expertise about what's going on in the cells. So we said dementia is a sort of catch-all term for acquired progressive cognitive impairment. So very, very a sort of a rather vague term. And then we've got the specific diseases. And the diseases are actually defined by what you see under the microscope if you look at the brain. And there are multiple causes for dementia, but broadly speaking, you can divide most of them up into two different forms. And those are diseases that affect the blood vessels in one way or another. We used to say vascular dementia, we now say vascular cognitive impairment, and neurodegenerative diseases. And the neurodegenerative diseases, which include Alzheimer's, dementia with Lewy bodies, semantic dementia, progressive supranuclear palsy, Parkinson's, many of these other conditions, all show common themes. And those common themes are that normal proteins within the brains for various reasons become tangled and dysfunctional, and that then leads to a process where other proteins become tangled and dysfunctional, and brain cells die, and the neurotransmitters that transmit information between them break down, and you get symptoms. And it's the different folding of the proteins that leads to the different diseases, and the fact that different proteins seem to particularly affect different parts of the brain explain to some extent the symptoms. So the proteins, the amyloid and the tau proteins, seem particularly to strike the memory areas of the brain. In Alzheimer's disease and in Parkinson's disease, it's the base of the brain, which leads to impairments of the neurotransmitters that are involved in movement. And in frontotemporal dementia, it seems to affect the front of the brain and affect behavior. And so we can think in terms of different therapies about different ways of targeting the specific proteins that cause the diseases, or perhaps downstream some of the other processes, inflammation, which we think is important when those proteins tangle, and then perhaps to more generic treatments that are trying to prevent cells from dying more generally. And so the treatments that I've mentioned as the amyloid clearing treatments, and to answer the question around tau, we think that amyloid starts before tau in Alzheimer's disease, and there is some evidence from the clinical trials that if you clear the amyloid, it is probably starting to affect the tau downstream, which gives us hope that actually we really might slow things in quite a significant way when these trials are run for longer. But as to the other approaches, it's around targeting either the other proteins or lots of the other processes that we think lead to the neurodegeneration in the neurodegenerative diseases. And I'll pass over to Selina, who will be best placed to touch on how those might be achieved and where we're heading in the different diseases.
Thanks, John. I don't actually think I've got very much to add to that. It was a really comprehensive answer. I think just to re-emphasize the point that, so there are a lot of active clinical trials happening in other forms of dementia. I wouldn't have time to go into all specific ones right now, but I think what John said is the really important concept, that what we learn from one disease, we can then apply to other diseases because they share so much commonality in the underlying processes, whether that be the accumulation of proteins that shouldn't be there. So we've talked a little bit about amyloid, we've talked about tau. There is also in some types of dementia, TDP43, alpha-synuclein. Although they're different proteins, we can take the same approaches to clearing them using antibodies, or actually using genetic therapies, we can take the same approaches to stop them from being produced and accumulating in the first place. So I think whenever we, get those first breakthroughs in the disease, that really then gives us the toolkit to understand how we intervene in others. I would just maybe spend a minute talking about inflammation. I saw that there was a question in the chat from Helen about this. And for me, this has been something that has really excited me recently, because we sort of, one school of thought is that, the amyloid is happening first, the tau is happening second. And actually, if we can break that link, then, this would be a very effective way to treat disease. And we've seen from recent genetic studies that there are a very small number of people who carry a protective gene that's linked to inflammation, and it has actually been able to break the link in those people. Now, the reason that I think that this is exciting is because, one, it's almost nature's experiment, for want of a better term, suggesting that a cure is possible, because here we have a real life example of where that link has been broken. But on a broader scale, it also tells us maybe another strategy that we need to think about in terms of disease intervention, which is if we target inflammation with a small molecule, for example, a drug, we can break that link in the wider population. And there are, to answer specifically Helen's questions, there are indeed trials happening targeting a protein called TREM2, which we know is really important in kind of Alzheimer's progression. We don't have the results of them yet, but I think we're all kind of quite excited to see them. And inflammation is something that happens not only in Alzheimer's, but in all forms of neurodegeneration.
Thank you so much, Selina. That was a really brilliant summary. And thank you for answering Helen's question there as well. David, I'm going to come to you. So we're going to move on a little bit now. I'm just a bit conscious of time. I feel like we could have we could all sit and talk here all afternoon about this topic. So perhaps to talk a little bit about diagnosis. So the question that we've had pre-submitted was, do you consider finding a cure to dementia as valuable as research on diagnosis? And which one would you prioritise? I realise that's a big question, but I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about some of the work that Alzheimer's Research UK is doing into diagnosis and why early diagnosis is important.
Absolutely. And I think maybe I'm going to give a politician's answer in saying that they are equally important. I know that you can really separate them. Because obviously we are in the position now where we can provide an early and accurate diagnosis with the right diagnostic tools, and a lot of the focus at the moment in terms of is how you make that more scalable, I guess. And you know, Jon and Selina are very knowledgeable on this point, but I'll try to answer on the sort of technical aspect. Currently, you can use either a PET scan to detect the levels of amyloid in someone's brain and determine whether they have Alzheimer's disease, or you could also do that by taking a lumbar puncture and a sample of fluid from the spine and looking at that. So a lot of the focus at the moment is the PET scans are very expensive and not very scalable for a health service to use, and lumbar puncture has a series of, I guess, people don't want to do a lumbar puncture unless there's a very good reason for doing it, understandably. So how could you scale that up more quickly? How could you make it cheaper and as safe as possible? So a lot of the focus is on blood tests, for example. There's a lot of evidence that's flowing from research about how that could be looked to help kind of find people who may have early or may have symptoms of a particular disease. So that's something which, from a research perspective, we're really interested in looking at. I think, but if you have that and no treatments, then obviously there is a huge value to knowing, what is the cause of your dementia, and there's lots of, there are lots of benefits that come from having that at an early stage. But I think, the best case scenario is it also helps you then match you either to a treatment or a clinical trial. And from a clinical trial point of view, it's a huge barrier in terms of finding the right people who are eligible for a trial. There are no trials, in interventional drug trials that look at just someone with dementia. You're looking for someone in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. So having accurate diagnosis that can be done at an early point is really important for finding that trial. And the more we go down the path of seeking regulatory approval for drugs, the more you need these really big multi-center trials with hundreds of people globally part of them. So finding the right people, I think, is really important. And then when we do have drugs available, that diagnosis will be so important for matching people to the right drugs. You won't be able to do that without good diagnosis. So I don't think you can separate the two, but we do need to see innovation and research in both of those areas so that you're looking at ultimately drugs that are safe, effective, easy to take, cheap as possible. That's the that's the dream. And it's the same with diagnostics, something that could be done that allows the health system to scale it up, so you're not looking at these difficult, expensive diagnoses. That's what health systems need, and that's what people with dementia need.
Thank you so much, David. Just to follow on from that sort of early detection question we had before. So Caroline has asked, how far ahead of symptoms appearing might one actually need to start taking a drug to prevent amyloid or tau buildup in the first place? As in, should people at risk eventually be taking drugs prophylactically? Jon, I wonder if I know we've touched a little bit on this already, but I wonder if you could answer Caroline's question.
Yeah. So what we think is occurring in Alzheimer's disease is that, and this actually touches on some of the other questions that come in, is that we think there is a strong genetic predisposition to developing Alzheimer's disease. Now, that's different from having a familial cause of Alzheimer's disease, which is rare, and that's less than 0.5% of people who have a faulty gene that will cause Alzheimer's disease. But we think there's quite a strong genetic predisposition. And studies, which are part funded by Alzheimer's Research UK, in fact, have shown that probably your genetic makeup will predict with about 70 to 80% certainty whether you will accumulate this amyloid protein within the brain. And so it's probably that the amyloid changes probably are occurring throughout your life, but begin to get manifest probably around 20 years before you get symptoms. And so we think of this probably in sort of 3 phases. There's a stage when people might be at risk of developing amyloid but haven't got any in the brain. And then there's a phase of 10 or 20 years when you start accumulating amyloid and some of these other proteins in the brain before you develop symptoms. So I think most people at the moment, most of the drug trials are focusing on mild Alzheimer's disease. But where we'll rapidly move to, and certainly I would want to move to, is people who are at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, so people who are accumulating the amyloid protein within the brain. We do need more research in that area because there are some people who will accumulate amyloid in the brain and not necessarily go on and get dementia. And we need to know who those people are, and we might need to leave them well alone. Or if you're going to accumulate amyloid in the brain and not develop dementia until you're 110, again, you might not want to take treatments in your 70s. Whereas if you are got amyloid in the brain and things are going to go downhill within a few years, then you might want to. So we need to be able to detect who's got amyloid in the brain, which we can do quite well now. And as David said, blood tests, I think, are going to be fabulous for this. But when we need to work out who is at risk of the neurodegeneration and then show that drugs intervene safely, then a bigger point is to try and understand more fundamentally what it is about some people's genetic makeup that causes them to accumulate amyloid in the throughout their lives, and then that might lead to some strategies, maybe not drug or other treatment ways that people can prevent that throughout their lives. We don't know what those are yet, but I will stress that around 40% of dementia worldwide is thought to be preventable through 12 potentially disease-modifying things that you can do in life. That doesn't mean if you follow them all, you will be fine, not necessarily, but things that we should all do. And I would encourage people to check out the brain health check-in that Alzheimer's Research UK that has developed, which is an online tool that you can go and check your own risk and what you can do about it. I think it's been accessed by about 200,000 people. Perhaps we can put that into the link for people to be able to check up on. So there's lots of things that we can do about our brain health more generally, and most of those are also good for your heart as well. So very well worth checking those things out in any case.
Thank you so much, John. Yes, I'm sure one of my colleagues will be able to pop the link to our brain health check-in in the chat just before we finish. So I'm just really conscious of time. So I'm going to ask for each of you, while we finish off, to, in maybe about a minute, sort of summarize one key thing or a few key things that you want the viewers today to take away from our discussion. Sort of what's sort of what thing are you most sort of passionate about? What can you see as the biggest hope for the future, or what sort of one thing you want people to take away from our talk today? Selina, I'm going to come to you first for that one.
I was hoping to be last, so I could have a few more times to think. Okay, I would say, I think what the new treatments that we've talked about today are far from perfect, but they do put us in a new era of dementia research. And I think for me, what I'm passionate about is it gives us that reassurance that research works. And so, the job is not done. As I mentioned, we need to pursue all avenues of investigation that are available to us. But it means that if we do stay motivated, we stay funded, and we get as many hands on deck as possible, we maintain capacity, we will see more and more of these treatments coming through that will touch on many of the themes that we discussed today. So treatments for different diseases, treatments that intervene at different stages of the disease process. And hopefully, my long-term vision is that we will have something for everyone. There will be options for anyone in terms of where they are on their diagnosis, where they are on the dementia journey, and where they are in what they want. David talked about this discussion should be led by what the person wants, and I think that's really important. And I know, although we didn't get to them, I know that there were questions around co-production. I think that's really crucial. It's not only what I want as a researcher, it's what the community wants. And I think we'll move towards a comprehensive, I won't say solution, but toolkit of things that will be available. So it's really an exciting time.
Thank you so much, Selina. David, the same question for you. What sort of one summary that you want our viewers to take away?
Yeah, it's a similar one to Selina. So I think absolutely the needs of people living with dementia need to be front and center of this, and that needs to be really embedded right the way through the research pathway, from the very early science all the way to when treatments and diagnosis are rolled out into the health service. That would be my first point. I think my second point is, as we've said, there is a lot of hope here. I think research is working, it's doing what it should do, but it's maintaining that momentum and having that stamina that I think we all need to continue to advocate in this space for dementia research and for new treatments. So I think we're all part of that marathon that we need to run for people with dementia.
Thank you, David. And finally, John, the same question to you.
I think it's going to be a similar theme. I think my my 2 words would be optimism and insistence. We really are at an optimistic stage. People ask about diagnosis versus treatments. We need all of those things, but my take is that we need to understand what causes these diseases. We need to be able to diagnose them early, and we need to have the treatments. And we're sort of 80 or 90% of all of those, and we need to kick them all over the top. And I think there's real optimism, with blood tests, understanding the genetics, what Selina can do with growing brains in dishes, with blood tests for diagnosing dementia, with treatments that can strip some of these proteins from the brain. This is a hugely exciting time. But we also need the insistence, because what's going to make the difference here is people saying this isn't good enough. This is what happened with the HIV drugs. People said, we're not going to put up with this. This needs to be prioritized. This is what happened with stroke services, with MS. We had people with these illnesses and the charities saying, this is not good enough. Yes, there's lots of competing interests and lots of competing ways for governments to spend money, but 50% of people living either themselves or their partner during Alzheimer's or with dementia during their lifetime, and the fact that it affects elderly people who tend to look after one another and not have massive health care until things really fall apart isn't good enough. And the fact that these are common diseases doesn't mean that they shouldn't get the attention and the funding. We can't stress how far behind the funding for dementia research is compared to cancer and cardiovascular disease. And it's dwarfed by the research money that went into COVID, and see how quickly things move. So there's optimism, but we need to be insistent. We need to be insistent that the funds for research keep flowing in, that this is a priority for people, and we need to let everybody know. We need to let our governments know that this is a priority if we're going to make the progress that it's really tangible.
Thank you so much, John. That was a brilliant summary. And thank you to the 3 of you for joining me on this discussion today. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I've really enjoyed it, and I hope everybody watching has as well. So we'll say goodbye to you all now. And then if everybody could stick around for a couple more minutes, I've got a bit of information to share with you. So hopefully appearing on your screen any second will be our contact information for our dementia research info line. So I know there are a few questions that we weren't able to answer today, and some where you might need some more personalized guidance or information on where to turn, and our dementia research info line is there to help. They can answer questions and signpost to other sources of information and support, so please do get in touch with them. You may also be interested in finding out more about our Join Dementia Research Service, which can match you to clinical research studies. This is open to anyone over the age of 18, and you do not need a dementia diagnosis to take part in these studies. One study for using lecanemab, which we've talked a little bit about today, in people at high risk of dementia, is still recruiting through JDR until the end of August. So you can find out more about getting involved in this, and if you might be a possible candidate, on the JDR website. We are also launching our brand new series of events for 2023, which is called Walk for a Cure. So this is our series of 5-kilometre fundraising walks across the UK for everyone impacted by dementia. Everyone is welcome at Walk for a Cure, whether you want to take part with your friends and family, with your colleagues, or solo. This year we are heading to London, Harrogate and Edinburgh, and we would love to see you there. You can find out more about the event and sign up to join us by visiting our website or searching for Walk for a Cure. And there should also be a link appearing in the chat for that as well. And of course, our work would not be possible without our incredible supporters. You can support our work in so many ways. And we've talked a little bit about this already, that without your input and ideas, without your amazing fundraising challenges, this research that we've been talking about today just would not be possible. But also, we really need people to volunteer and campaign for us. David's talked about how important it is to bring dementia to the forefront of government. So we need people to be campaigning for us too. So if you've been inspired by our event today and you want to find out more, please do head over to our website to find out more about how you can support us. And finally, I want to say a huge thank you for joining us today. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and we hope to see you again soon. If you've got time to stick around, I'm hoping there might also be a poll that might appear at the end. I know we're running slightly over on our event, so we just really want to quickly hear, what did you think of our talks today? Did you think they were too technical, about right, or too simple? Would you recommend lab notes to your friends and family? And have you learned something new about dementia research today? So if you've got 2 minutes to just answer those questions, we would really appreciate it. And then we'll pop those on the screen in a couple of seconds when you've all answered as well. So I'll just leave that up while you answer those. And that's perfect. Everybody's saying that the talks were just right. Everybody would recommend, which is brilliant, and everybody's learned something new. Perfect. So thank you again for joining us. Massive thank you again to David, Selina, and John for joining us too, and we hope to see you at the next event. Bye.